From his usual spot, Yonzawa watched in silence. Staring out the window was one of his most ingrained habits. He felt that by doing so, he could detach himself, if only for a moment, from a reality that, to him, was nothing more than a monotonous and predictable routine. However, something had begun to change over the past few days. Little by little, his attention drifted away from the outside scenery and turned toward the girl sitting next to him. A quiet gal who, inexplicably, was beginning to catch his eye. That girl was Hachiya Kairi, and in the new school term, fate had placed them in the same class. What struck him the most was how she applied her makeup in front of everyone with complete ease, showing not the slightest hint of discomfort about the stares she received. That, without a doubt, surprised him. On more than one occasion, he found himself wondering why gals chose to dress so strikingly, and whether watching them get ready didn't somehow take away part of the magic. Despite everything, there was Hachiya, calmly brushing on mascara, as if time had no hold over her. Suddenly, without warning, she stood up from her seat with a determined gesture. Yonzawa, intrigued, followed her with his gaze from his desk. To his surprise, she walked over, leaned in slightly, and placed her makeup pouch on his desk, completely invading his personal space. Yonzawa could barely react. He opened his eyes wide in a mix of surprise and discomfort, and clumsily managed to mutter a hesitant, "Go ahead." Hachiya, in contrast, kept a calm expression, no trace of provocation or embarrassment. Without another word, she sat on his desk, turning her back to him, while he remained stiff, watching her in silence. As the days went by, that routine became a habit. Every morning, Hachiya-san would take that spot to do her makeup, taking advantage of the morning light coming through the window. Apparently, from her own seat, the shadow of her body made it hard to see her hands clearly. So without asking for permission, she simply settled where it was most comfortable for her. Yonzawa, resigned, knew that from that position he could no longer see outside. Instead, he observed how she applied her makeup without concern for others' judgment or the aesthetics of the moment. Each day, she seemed to apply more product around her eyes, with an intensity that left him wondering whether that process had any kind of limit. Then, the teacher entered the classroom and asked everyone to take their seats. From his spot, Yonzawa kept watching Hachiya. He wondered, with a certain curiosity, what was going on with that gal who seemed incapable of acting like the rest. In the middle of his thoughts, the teacher announced there would be a physical exam in the afternoon. At that moment, Yonzawa noticed a pleasant scent in the air. He sniffed lightly. Something smelled really good. When he turned, he realized why. Hachiya had taken out her bento and was already eating in the middle of class. As if it were the most natural thing in the world, she chewed calmly, making no effort to hide. Yonzawa couldn't help but mutter to himself that she really was eating during homeroom. As he looked at her food, he thought it was all chunks of meat with bones. He wondered if it was Christmas or what she could possibly be celebrating. She tried to cover the bento with her textbook, though it was obvious anyone could see it. A bone even stuck out from her mouth as she continued chewing with puffed-out cheeks. The teacher, upon noticing, pointed at her firmly and demanded an explanation. Hachiya looked at him without replying, her gaze intense, locked on his eyes. From his seat, Yonzawa watched as the teacher scolded her while she, with her mouth still full, shot him a look filled with contempt. He thought that if she was already on the teacher's radar on the very first day, he couldn't imagine how she expected to survive the next 2 years. The teacher, visibly upset, ordered her to go to the teacher's office after class. Hachiya barely reacted. A small drop of sweat ran down her cheek, but she said nothing. Yonzawa thought the scolding would make her feel bad. However, she lifted her head firmly and met the teacher's eyes, openly defying him. Even the teacher seemed frozen for a moment, slowly turning his face toward her. Yonzawa, now sweating, couldn't stop thinking about how incredibly free Hachiya-san was. When lunchtime arrived, the mood in the classroom became more relaxed. Even so, a couple of classmates began whispering to each other, casting furtive glances in Hachiya's direction. They said she had started eating in the middle of class, that she had glared at the teacher like she wanted to kill him. While they admitted she was pretty, they also clearly said she was scary. In the end, they concluded that maybe it would be best not to invite her to anything. Yonzawa realized it immediately. They were already beginning to fear her. Faced with the situation, he opened his lunch bag, and upon seeing it full of onigiri, he figured it was a good enough time to eat. However, at that moment, he felt someone's gaze fixed on him. Hachiya was staring at him intently. He turned his head, visibly nervous, and asked if something was wrong. To his surprise, she looked puzzled. She touched her chin, as if he were the one acting strangely. As a result, Yonzawa couldn't understand why she was the one looking surprised. From their desks, the direction of her gaze was obvious. It was aimed directly at his food. That's when he began to suspect. Maybe, he thought, since she had already eaten all of her own food earlier, now she was interested in what he had. Her audacity, in any case, was undeniable. In disbelief, he decided to offer her one of his onigiri. He figured that, in the end, the whole situation was somewhat amusing, and casually mentioned that an onigiri wasn't a big deal. She took it without hesitation and bit into it, using both hands with a look of satisfaction that bordered on childlike. Yonzawa watched her, slightly blushing, while she kept eating with delight, showing not the slightest concern. In that moment, he thought that Hachiya-sen really lived in the moment, 100%, and that, somehow, made him feel a bit envious, though he would never want to be like that himself. She wiped her mouth calmly, her face relaxed and wearing a faint smile. Then, with bright eyes and cheeks slightly flushed, she looked at him innocently. Yonzawa, once again, had no idea what was coming next. He noticed her gaze again. She lowered her eyes to her own bento, which made Yonzawa wonder if she was going to take that too. He couldn't help but ask himself how much this girl could possibly eat. So he turned to her with a straightforward question. He reminded her that they had body measurements later and asked if it was okay to be eating so much. She seemed surprised but didn't take her eyes off Yonzawa's onigiri, and he, not thinking much of it, remarked that he'd probably give it to her anyway. Hachiya remained completely still, a bit of drool slipping from her mouth as she savored the onigiri she was still holding. To Yonzawa, this was revealing. He had always had the impression that this girl only thought 1 second ahead, never pausing to consider anything beyond that. However, as he continued to observe her more closely, something began to shift in his perception. Seeing her like that, with that carefree expression, everything started to seem absurdly silly. Hachiya kept eating the onigiri awkwardly, while Yonzawa began to consider that maybe the problem wasn't her at all, but himself. The fact that he had decided long ago that reality was boring. Then he came to an uncomfortable conclusion. He was just as foolish as she was. And to make matters worse, he hadn't even eaten his own onigiri. Time passed without him realizing, and it was already afternoon. In the classroom, the teacher stood at the front as he handed out papers, explaining that he was returning the results of the physical exam. The atmosphere was the usual, until he called Hachiya to come forward. She stood up and walked toward the teacher. Meanwhile, the rest of the students went about their business. However, when she received the exam, Hachiya lowered her head. Her face was hidden by her hair, and her body tensed noticeably. Yonzawa noticed it immediately. Watching her, he felt something was off. He couldn't explain it, but he was certain that something was wrong. Without warning, Hachiya ran out of the classroom through the back door. The teacher reacted too late and shouted for her to stop, asking where she was going, but she had already disappeared down the hallway. Yonzawa felt a strange pressure in his chest. He didn't understand what that feeling was, but it was there, growing. He pressed his lips together and looked away, trying to convince himself it had nothing to do with him, that it wasn't his problem, that there was no reason to be concerned about the girl who sat next to him. He kept repeating to himself that he shouldn't get involved, over and over, until he almost believed it. But the memories wouldn't leave him alone. Images of Hachiya eating came back to him, showing her face with puffed-out cheeks, again and again. He looked down, hesitating, caught between what he thought and what he felt. Before he realized it, he was already standing up from his seat. Without thinking too much about it, Yonzawa said he was going to check on Hachiya. The teacher, somewhat surprised by the initiative, barely managed a nervous okay, as the student was already heading quickly toward the door. He ran through the school hallway, the memory still vivid in his mind. The image of Hachiya, just as she had been only minutes before, kept replaying. Although she usually acted at her own pace, this time her behavior was, without a doubt, unusually strange. In the distance, he saw her entering another area of the building. He was completely certain it was her. He assumed she was probably heading to the rooftop. And sure enough, that's where he found her. Hachiya was lifting her sweater, exposing her stomach. At that moment, nerves took hold of Yonzawa. In his mind, he could only think about her belly. He watched in confusion as she pressed on her abdomen with both hands. From another angle, the image became even clearer. Her stomach compressed slightly as the fabric of her clothes stretched to the limit. Next, Hachiya pressed again, this time with more force. Finally, her belly gradually returned to its natural shape. She smiled, eyes closed, as if the whole thing were nothing more than a silly game. In that instant, Yonzawa understood. She really was playing. However, quite suddenly, Hachiya seemed to snap back to reality. As if becoming aware of what she was doing, she murmured that it had come back. Her face changed, showing clear discomfort. She lowered her head, and her expression grew dull, lifeless. That's when Yonzawa understood. She was crying. Still nervous, he brought a hand to his mouth as he watched her in silence. Hachiya lifted her face just slightly, and in that exact moment, their eyes met. That brief instant left him completely frozen. He knew for certain they had looked directly at each other. She reacted immediately. She turned sharply, her face burning with embarrassment and visible irritation. Yonzawa, for his part, partially covered his own face with one hand, as if trying to become invisible. He kept telling himself that he hadn't done anything, that he wasn't even looking at her stomach or anything like that. Then, Hachiya raised her hand forcefully, as if about to say something. She approached him with purpose. Her face leaned toward him, cheeks flushed, and wearing an intense expression that made the seriousness of the moment unmistakable. With firmness, she declared that what had just happened was a secret. Without waiting for a response, she turned on her heel and hurried off backward, as if escaping. Yonzawa tried to stop her with a word, but it was already too late. He was left standing there, confused, not understanding anything that had just happened. From the outside, the school building looked just the same as always, with the clock marking the passage of time indifferently. Yet in his mind, everything felt different. He knew that what he had just witnessed had affected him in some deep way. Later, when he returned to the classroom, the teacher was waiting for him with a clearly displeased look. Leaning on the desk, Yonzawa entered without saying a word and sat down. From his desk, his gaze instinctively turned toward the window. He had always liked looking outside. It made him feel like he could clear his mind, escape, if only for a moment, from a reality he found so dull. This time, however, something was different. He looked up and saw her. Hachiya was leaning on his desk, hands on her cheeks, blushing, looking at him intently. That's when he thought that maybe, just maybe, he should start looking more inside the classroom. From that moment on, the days that used to all feel the same began, little by little, to gain some color. Meanwhile, the teacher took attendance and reviewed homework. At one point, he called Yonzawa by name. Yonzawa slowly looked up. His head was still full of thoughts. He felt overwhelmed by the impact of the day before. Irritated, the teacher asked if he hadn't slept well. Yonzawa apologized, slightly embarrassed. The teacher didn't press further and simply asked him to read page 17 of the textbook. Yonzawa sat with the book open in front of him, but he was completely unable to focus. His mind seemed to be elsewhere. The images from the previous day remained vivid. Although Hachiya hadn't given what happened much importance, he couldn't help but think that it had definitely been strange. In fact, he even doubted whether she truly knew who he was. It seemed unlikely that she actually recognized him. Maybe, in truth, she hadn't even noticed him until that moment. When class ended, Yonzawa left the room. That day, like many recent ones, he hadn't been able to concentrate. He felt the need to do something to regain his focus, so he decided to stay and study a bit before heading home. As a first step, he thought about stopping by a cafe, hoping to eat something and clear his mind. However, as soon as he entered the place, what he saw left him completely frozen. There, sitting at a table, was Hachiya, eating again. He couldn't help but stop and stare at her, and immediately wondered, somewhat incredulously, if she was seriously eating breaded shrimp after school. At that moment, a waitress approached him and kindly asked if he would like to order something. Yonzawa, who had stopped right next to Hachiya's table, responded with clear nervousness. He mumbled a few words, unsure of what to say. In the end, they both ended up sitting at separate tables. While browsing the menu, Yonzawa felt a fixed gaze on him. When he glanced up briefly, he noticed she was watching him in silence, trying to maintain his composure. He raised his hand to call the waitress and ordered something. The tension in the air was unmistakable. The situation was undoubtedly awkward. Trying to distract himself, he went back to reading the menu, avoiding paying too much attention. Without overthinking it, he ordered a coffee jelly. He didn't want to bother her, he just needed a bit of sugar to study. His plan was simple: study for an hour, then go home. However, he soon felt an intense gaze piercing through him. Hachiya was staring directly at him from her table. When she realized he had noticed, she let out a faint sound, swallowing hard. That's when Yonzawa understood what was happening. Hachiya was eyeing his coffee jelly. He took a spoonful and brought it to his mouth, trying to convince himself that sugar was necessary for studying. But Hachiya wouldn't stop staring at him. She kept swallowing repeatedly, again and again, her body rigid. At that moment, Yonzawa began to feel afraid. Her reaction seemed far too intense. The constant, wet sound of Hachiya swallowing became exaggerated, almost tangible, as if it were invading the space between them. To him, that sound was impossible to ignore. In his mind, a clear, annoyed thought emerged. He reminded himself that they were both still wearing their school uniforms, which made the whole thing even more inappropriate. Also, involuntarily, he found himself comparing that sound to someone chugging beer straight from a mug. At the same time, he realized something else. Hachiya didn't even seem aware of what she was doing. She was visibly struggling with her craving to eat. Yonzawa watched her seriously as a thin bead of sweat began to roll down his face. It was then that he reached a decisive conclusion. The only one who could put an end to this situation was himself. With determination, he walked over to Hachiya and told her to open her mouth. She reacted in surprise, not fully understanding what was happening. Just before the spoon entered her mouth gently, as she swallowed, she let out a nearly inaudible sigh, exhaling slowly. Her expression began to change. Little by little, her face relaxed, taking on a calm and happy appearance, as she rested her hands on her cheeks with visible satisfaction. Seeing her like that, Yonzawa felt an unexpected sense of relief. Thankfully, she had calmed down. The coffee jelly, still mostly untouched, remained on the table. Yonzawa looked at it, and with a calm gesture, let her know that if she liked it, she could finish it. Then, he left some money in a nearby glass, picked up his backpack, and stood up, simply saying that he was heading out. As he walked away, he thought, not without resignation, that he wouldn't be able to study at all like this. However, just at that moment, he felt someone grab his arm. It was Hachiya. She looked up at him with a sincere expression and thanked him for the food. Yonzawa's face flushed slightly. Inside, a clear thought surfaced. She had remembered him. Sometime later, the scene shifted to the sports field. The teacher announced that today they would be holding the physical fitness test, starting with the handball throw for the girls. Hachiya, already dressed in her gym clothes, held the ball in her hands. From a distance, Yonzawa watched her silently, wondering to himself whether she was good at sports. Finally, Hachiya threw the ball with force. However, after a brief pause, the teacher stated neutrally that the distance was 0. Upon seeing that result, Yonzawa thought Hachiya was completely useless. For her part, Hachiya brought a hand to her head with a confused expression. Just as another classmate announced that the next test would be the grip strength test. Then, Yonzawa reflected that, given Hachiya's imposing presence, her strength should be considerable. However, when he saw her squeezing the device with intense effort, the gauge barely registered 12 kilograms. At that, Yonzawa concluded that she was truly weak. He adjusted his glasses, sweating slightly, and anticipated that the next test would be the flexibility assessment. When Hachiya attempted to stretch, she only managed to reach 2 centimeters, which led Yonzawa to think that she was surprisingly stiff. He watched her silently, wondering if, in reality, she was just bad at sports in general. Shortly after, the teacher announced the start of the shuttle run. Meanwhile, Yonzawa looked on with a hopeful attitude, thinking that at least during the running portion, she might show better performance. When the signal sounded, Hachiya started off with determination. However, as she ran, her belly was clearly visible, something that was impossible to hide. Yonzawa watched her seriously, keeping his eyes forward. Suddenly, Hachiya stumbled clumsily on the track and collapsed, as if all her strength had left her. Just then, a ball came flying toward him, and someone shouted to warn him. Before he could react, the ball struck him directly in the face. One of his friends shouted while Yonzawa covered his face, embarrassed. They scolded him for being so distracted, and another comment followed mockingly, suggesting that he had been staring too hard at Hachiya. Yonzawa denied it awkwardly, thinking it wasn't like that. The conversation shifted when one of the boys said that, speaking of Jairus, Yuzuki was more his type. Yonzawa repeated the name with curiosity, and they pointed to the girl who was next to Hachiya. A group of students had gathered around a figure sprawled on the ground, dramatically spread out like a splatter. Upon seeing her, Yonzawa wondered if she was melting, but when he recognized her, he realized it was Hachiya. She was lying on the floor with an exhausted expression. Yonzawa deduced that she had probably run out of energy due to hunger. Around her, some students whispered that she had lost interest and just decided to lie down, calling her behavior arrogant. Others commented that the situation was a bit uncomfortable. Then, a pretty and confident girl stepped in naturally, explaining that there was no need to worry, that this sort of thing happened to her often. Even so, Yonzawa kept wondering whether that was really true. Noticing the scene, the PE teacher reacted with alarm, gesturing and asking what was going on, even considering the possibility that she was sick. He immediately ordered that someone take her to the nurse's office. That's when another student suggested that Yonzawa be the one to help. From the back, Yonzawa protested, but the teacher had already made the decision and gave him the task, telling the rest of the class to return. In silence, with a bead of sweat sliding down his face, Yonzawa walked over to Hachiya and expressed his concern. She responded by weakly raising her hands from the ground, as if asking for help. She was lying on her back, arms extended toward him, her expression vacant, cheeks flushed, and her eyes glassy. She was barely responsive. Yonzawa watched her, nervous and sweating, realizing he would have to lift her by himself. However, Hachiya remained motionless, arms open, gaze unfocused. When no one helped her sit up, she began moving on her own, letting out small sounds of effort. Yonzawa finally understood the situation and stepped closer. He took her hands and pulled her up, putting in a great effort. Even so, Hachiya barely reacted. Yonzawa felt her entire weight fall on him, and he couldn't help but suspect, deep down, that maybe she just wanted to be pampered. After everything that had happened, Yonzawa found himself standing inside a store, in front of the counter. While selecting a few items, he thought he had already bought something for lunch. However, that thought kept slipping away every time he recalled what had happened when he returned to class. Something had changed. To his surprise, there were more gal-style girls than usual. As he entered the classroom with the bag in hand, he immediately understood that his seat no longer belonged to him. At that exact moment, a blonde girl with an exaggerated smile was applying makeup to Hachiya, who remained still, letting the other do her work. Both of them noticed his presence at nearly the same time. Without showing any emotion, Yonzawa extended his arm and offered what he had brought, accompanied by a simple question. He asked Hachiya if she wanted that for today and handed her the food he had bought. She accepted it without hesitation and immediately began eating with clear delight. Her enthusiasm was so obvious that it looked like she was devouring 2 onigiri at once. Meanwhile, Yuzuki, the blonde girl, watched them in surprise, her eyes focused on Hachiya, and she wondered whether someone other than her was feeding Kiai, the nickname she used for Hachiya. Her expression immediately shifted. It grew more intense as she stared directly at Yonzawa. Without mincing words, she asked him point-blank who he was. Yonzawa, visibly uncomfortable, replied briefly and introduced himself without hesitation. However, inwardly, he couldn't help but think that this girl was already sitting in his seat without permission. And now, on top of that, acting completely familiar. Far from backing down, Yuzuki introduced herself with a confident smile, stating her name was Hani Yuzuki. and firmly clarified that she and Hachiya had been together since kindergarten. She told him not to forget it. From that moment, a subtle tension filled the air. Yuzuki stared at him with hostility, while he kept a reserved attitude, not looking for a confrontation. That's when Yuzuki faced him directly. She said she had seen him feeding Hachiya quite confidently and asked what exactly his relationship with her was. Yonzawa answered seriously, saying it was nothing special. But Yuzuki didn't seem satisfied. She pressed further, asking if he had ever given Hachiya anything carbonated. Yonzawa, keeping a straight face, replied no, never. At that, Yuzuki reacted with surprise, as if confirming her point. She stated that then he clearly didn't know Hachiya disliked carbonated drinks so much that they could even make her cry. Yonzawa remained silent, not responding. Even so, Yuzuki continued her questioning. She wanted to know if he had ever pushed Hachiya on a swing, implying that Hachiya couldn't swing by herself. A little uneasy, Yonzawa admitted that no, he hadn't had the chance. Yuzuki smiled, visibly pleased with his answer, and was about to continue, but Yonzawa interrupted her. In a firm voice, he simply pointed out that the place where she was sitting was his seat. Yuzuki reacted with surprise, looking at him from where she sat. Her expression changed immediately. She asked if that was really his seat, and then hit him with a new question. Had he gotten close to Hachiya with ulterior motives? Yonzawa looked at her seriously, unshaken, and wondered how she had reached that conclusion. Yuzuki, touching her chest, fell silent for a moment, as if reflecting. Then, in a low voice, she murmured a simple, "wow," as if reconsidering what she had just said. Her face reddened slightly, and she whispered that in that case, this was still her privilege. Finally, she let out a deep sigh, releasing all the tension that had built up. At that moment, Yuzuki leaned toward Hachiya and hugged her warmly, a gesture sincere and full of affection. Hachiya, for her part, couldn't help but blush. Meanwhile, Yonzawa watched the scene in silence, sweating in discomfort, thinking that those kinds of things between girls made it hard to know where to look. Hachiya remained seated next to Yuzuki, the two of them very close. In silence, they both looked at Yonzawa, the protagonist, faces slightly flushed. Without saying a single word, Hachiya's face showed a calm expression, though marked by slight tension. She said nothing, but in her gaze there was a subtle mixture of tenderness and emotional restraint. At that moment, Yonzawa felt her eyes on him, and surprised, he turned around. However, he quickly looked away, unsettled, silently asking himself what that expression had meant. Even if she looked at him like that, he kept insisting to himself that he hadn't done anything. That was when, from the back of the classroom, Yuzuki's voice suddenly broke the silence with energy. She shouted that the next class would take place in the gym, abruptly interrupting the moment between Yonzawa and Hachiya. With a playful tone and a flirtatious pose, Yuzuki turned to Yonzawa with a smile, telling him she had left his seat nice and warm. But Yonzawa didn't respond. He stayed silent, showing no reaction at all to her comment. Just as they were about to leave, something unexpected happened. Yonzawa took Hachiya's hand and, without saying much, handed her something. The gesture caught her completely off guard. When she opened her hand, Hachiya saw it was a piece of chocolate. Meanwhile, Yuzuki began hurrying her along, warning that it was time to change clothes and that if she kept spacing out like that, they'd be late for class. In that moment, Hachiya stopped. Without thinking too much, she brought the chocolate to her mouth and ate it. Her face lit up with a simple kind of happiness, something different from her usual expression. Yuzuki, seeing her, was stunned. She asked what was going on, saying it was the first time she'd ever seen that face on her. She remarked that even if it was subtle, there was something different in Hachiya's expression. Finally, she fired off another question: what the hell was she eating? The scene shifted again. From outside, the school building was shown, marking the arrival of the long-awaited lunch break. With excitement, Yuzuki raised her hand and cheerfully called out to Hachiya, suggesting they go eat on the rooftop. However, Hachiya remained silent. She lowered her gaze, and without saying anything, stared directly at Yonzawa. Seeing this, Yuzuki looked at her in confusion, wondering if Hachiya actually wanted to have lunch with Yonzawa. As she walked, she reflected in silence, remembering the previous day, when she had misunderstood Hachiya and impulsively acted on that. That scene still made her feel guilty. Now she understood she had to respect Hachiya's wishes to be more understanding. In her mind, she pictured the captain of the soccer club and imagined herself beside him, telling herself with determination that if she didn't change, she would never become her senpai's girlfriend. Back in reality, Yuzuki raised her voice and called out to Yonzawa energetically, asking him to wait. A little later, the three of them, Hachiya, Yuzuki, and Yonzawa, were sitting together for lunch. The atmosphere was peaceful. Hachiya sat very close to Yonzawa, showing no sign of discomfort. For his part, he thought that eating together wasn't so bad, although he quietly admitted to himself that he had only brought food for one. With enthusiasm, Yuzuki held up her lunchbox, and with a proud smile, declared that there was nothing to worry about that day. Her mom had made Hachiya's lunch. Upon hearing that, Yonzawa simply replied that if that was the case, then it was fine. He said nothing more. Internally, Yuzuki's eyes sparkled with intensity. Mentally, she shouted with conviction that yes, that's right. The lunch she had brought was a declaration in itself, a double-layered bento box filled with gleaming, carefully arranged fried chicken. That day, lunch at home meant one thing and one thing only: fried chicken, stacked in 2 full layers. Yuzuki thought with fierce determination that she would fill Hachiya's stomach so much there'd be no room for anything else. She was sorry, but her goal wasn't just to feed her. She wanted to make Yonzawa feel the sting of defeat. Meanwhile, Yonzawa remained calm, his expression unchanged. He casually took out his own lunchbox. Inside was yakisoba, simple noodles, but well prepared. Without thinking much about it, he began adding mayonnaise to them, as if none of this affected him in the slightest. Hachiya watched in silence, saying nothing. Her face remained calm, but her eyes were completely fixed on Yonzawa's food. Though she didn't speak, it was obvious she was paying attention with absolute focus. That was when Yuzuki noticed the scene. Internally, she jolted. She couldn't believe Hachiya was staring so intensely over a simple stream of mayonnaise. Seeing this, she looked back down at her own lunch. She remembered then that fried chicken was, without a doubt, Hachiya's favorite food. That's why she couldn't afford to lose. But the unexpected happened. Hachiya snatched the lunch straight out of her hands. Yuzuki was left frozen, feeling a mix of resignation and certainty. Deep down, she thought she had always known. Hachiya preferred Yonzawa's food. However, that assumption dissolved in seconds. To her surprise, Hachiya didn't keep the food for herself. Instead, she brought her bento close to Yonzawa's and, without saying a word, began mixing the contents of both lunches. Holding her chopsticks, she combined the ingredients with total ease, completely ignoring the astonished stares around her. Yonzawa looked at her, baffled, still not fully understanding what that gesture meant. Meanwhile, Yuzuki was falling apart inside. She had mixed everything. She could barely react, muttering in disbelief that her beloved fried chicken had been absorbed by the yakisoba. Next to her, Yonzawa shared the same feeling. In a low voice, eyes blank, he lamented that his yakisoba had also vanished in the fusion. Meanwhile, Hachiya remained unbothered. She held her chopsticks firmly and kept her eyes locked on the food. With complete seriousness and without hesitation, she prepared to eat, and without further delay, began slurping up the noodles with enthusiasm. She slurped loudly, the exaggerated sounds reflecting a genuine hunger. Nothing seemed to stop her. Yonzawa tried to intervene. Maybe he wanted to point out what she had just done or say something, but he didn't get the chance. In just a few seconds, the container was completely empty. Then, Hachiya paused, as if snapping out of a trance. She opened her eyes, surprised by what she had done, and with a sweet, slightly embarrassed look, touched her lips with a finger and lowered her voice. She admitted she hadn't thought it through. She had simply eaten everything. Yuzuki looked down, overwhelmed with guilt. She thought all of this had happened only because she suggested the three of them eat together. Maybe that hadn't been such a good idea after all. However, Yonzawa saw it differently. Inside, he felt it wasn't something to be upset about. If someone could eat with such eagerness and sincerity, to the point of making everything seem more delicious, then maybe that had value too. From his perspective, it deserved respect. Yuzuki watched him quietly, wondering if, deep down, Yonzawa had a bigger heart than he let on. Hachiya, still with a bit of food in her mouth, looked at both of them. Her expression was a mix of tenderness, embarrassment, and calm. She didn't say anything, but her gestures spoke for her. The three of them remained seated together. Then, in a more relaxed tone, Yuzuki offered Yonzawa some of the food left at the bottom of her bento. He, a bit surprised, accepted without much confidence, thanking her for the gesture. Hachiya, as usual, stayed silent. Yuzuki turned to her and, with a mix of scolding and affection, pointed out that she still had food in her mouth. Even though lunch had been chaotic, unexpected, and a little out of control, at the very least, they had shared it in a friendly way. Meanwhile, the story shifted to Kuji Umezu, Yonzawa's childhood friend, who had begun reflecting on the recent changes he'd noticed in him. He remarked that he had always known Yonzawa as someone indifferent, reserved, a person unaffected by others or by circumstances. But lately, something had changed. Now, Yonzawa seemed to show interest in Hachiya, that well-known gal girl. Kuji thought that, despite having known him since elementary school, he had never known anything about his romantic life. Then came the day when Yonzawa did something unexpected. He approached him and asked for a favor. Specifically, he asked Kuji to help some girls with their studying. He said it directly, almost like it didn't matter. But to Kuji, it was completely out of character. After all, Yonzawa wasn't the type to ask for favors. Seeing him act that way left Kuji puzzled. And sure, Kuji was smart. That's probably why Yonzawa had approached him. Still, the whole situation made him think. Yuzuki, for her part, also seemed worried. Holding a few low-scoring tests in her hands, she showed them to Kuji, explaining that if Hachiya failed the year, the two of them would be separated, and that was something she absolutely couldn't allow to happen. Shortly after, all four of them were gathered in the library. Yonzawa, Kuji, Yuzuki, and Hachiya sat together, surrounded by books, attempting to study as a group. Kuji observed the scene with a mix of curiosity and amusement. From his perspective, things were starting to get interesting. Driven by his inquisitive nature, Kuji couldn't hold back a direct question. He wanted to know if Hachiya had a boyfriend. Yuzuki's reaction was immediate. She glared at him with clear hostility and fired back with a question of her own. Why did he want to know? Kuji, unfazed, answered calmly. He said he was simply wondering what kind of relationship Yonzawa and Hachiya had. Far from clarifying anything, that response only confused Yuzuki even more. Kuji decided then to explain his point better. He said that Yonzawa had never shown interest in anyone. He was someone who lived at his own pace, uninvolved in other people's business, which made him easy to get along with. However, ever since Hachiya started sitting next to him, something had started to change. According to Kuji, Yonzawa was beginning to show signs of humanity, as if, little by little, he were becoming softer. Yuzuki listened, a bit puzzled, unsure what he meant by that. That's when Kuji recalled what Yonzawa had been like during junior high. Much more serious, locked in his own world, distant from everything. Taking advantage of this moment of honesty, Yuzuki pointed out that Hachiya had also changed recently. She had noticed small new details. Her skin looked more radiant, her scent more pleasant, her eyelashes seemed longer, and her eyes sparkled with more intensity. It was as if she was radiating a special aura. In response, Kuji muttered a single word with a reverent tone, pheromones. That's when Yonzawa interrupted them firmly, scolding them to stop talking and focus on studying. Kuji, a little embarrassed, apologized immediately. Still, something else caught his attention. Hachiya was completely unmotivated. Slumped in her chair, she drooped like a lifeless sack, a pencil dangling from her nose, as if her mind was miles away. It was easy to see she had no intention of studying at all. Kuji could barely hold back his laughter at the sight. Yuzuki also burst out laughing. The two of them watched her, amused, as Kuji whispered that Hachiya had totally lost the will to go on. Yuzuki, still laughing, confirmed that her expression was a complete disaster. Suddenly, Yonzawa raised his voice, shouting at Hachiya to wake up. Noticing that she had fallen asleep, the pen slipped from her hand as she leaned forward, fast asleep. Calmly, Yonzawa approached her and pointed out that she had dropped her pen. He tried to encourage her with a gentle voice, asking her to push herself just a little more. Kuji watched in silence, genuinely surprised. He had never seen that expression on Yonzawa's face before. In his mind, the thought was clear. He had never seen that face on him. And in that moment, he realized that maybe, just maybe, the person who could finally break through Yonzawa's wall of indifference was, unexpectedly, a girl like her. Then, Yonzawa made a small gesture. He placed a little piece of candy on Hachiya's notebook and told her that if she ate it, she'd probably be able to hang in there a little longer. Hachiya looked at him sweetly and smiled, happy with the small gesture, grateful, and began eating with delight. However, Yonzawa noticed something strange. Kuji's gaze made him uneasy. He asked directly what was up with him, since he'd been smiling to himself for a while now. Kuji didn't say much. He simply replied that it was nothing, but deep down, he knew exactly what it was. That was the smell of love, the kind only a friend could recognize. Later, the tension completely disappeared. Yuzuki celebrated excitedly, showing her test results with a mix of surprise and joy. She laughed, saying she had almost failed, but in the end, had barely passed. The whole group shared in the relief. It had been close, but they had made it. Yonzawa commented that the result had been right on the edge, but even so, it was a real relief. Amid the shared joy over the exam results, it was Yuzuki who had a sudden idea. As naturally as if it were the most obvious thing in the world, she suggested throwing a celebration party on Sunday, with everyone invited. The proposal caught Yonzawa off guard, and he paused, confused. He hadn't expected to be included at all. That's why he asked, somewhat uncertainly, if he was actually invited too. Hachiya, for her part, was clearly excited. Her expression said it all. She was more enthusiastic about the idea than anyone else. At last, Sunday arrived. Yonzawa walked alone through the city at a relaxed pace. As he moved forward, he reflected on how unusual it was for him to see his friends on a day off. It had been so long since he went out like that, the moment almost felt unreal. Suddenly, his phone vibrated. Looking at the screen, he saw messages from Kuji and Yuzuki. Both were letting him know they'd be late. One had just woken up. The other apologized. Nothing unusual for Yonzawa, who had already expected the delays. While waiting, something caught his attention. Among the crowd, one figure stood out clearly. First, he noticed a pair of tall boots, but when he looked up, he froze. Standing in front of him was Hachiya. Though he recognized her immediately, he struggled to process what he was seeing. It wasn't that he didn't know who she was, it was that her appearance was radically different. She was dressed like a full-fledged Jaru, flashy clothes, bold style, and a confidence that radiated from every step. His first thought was simple. She looked older. But as he looked more closely, he came to a more honest conclusion. She didn't have an ounce of shame about dressing that way. Everything they had experienced in the past few days had almost made him forget. But now it hit him again with clarity. Hachiya-san was, without a doubt, a Jaru. In that instant, he wondered whether she was really the same girl. Even though only her appearance had changed, it felt like he was meeting her for the first time. Before he could greet her, he noticed she was staring intently at a restaurant. Her attention was completely focused on that place. And in that moment, Yonzawa understood, yes, this was still Hachiya-san. He approached her calmly and called out to get her attention. Since the others were running late, he suggested going in to eat something while they waited. The decision was quick. Both agreed and went inside the restaurant. Soon after, the ramen arrived at the table. The warm, rich aroma filled the air with a comforting feeling. A waiter warned them the soup was hot and asked them to be careful. Hachiya picked up her chopsticks naturally and got ready to eat. She put her hands together in a respectful gesture, quietly giving thanks for the meal. Then, with patience, she began blowing on the noodles to cool them and slurped them calmly. Though the heat was still noticeable, Yonzawa could only watch her silently. As she ate, one noodle, pulled in by her slurping, flicked straight onto her stomach. The reaction was instant. Hachiya let out a sharp yelp, crying out that it burned. She squirmed in her seat, waving her hands in desperation from the heat. Yonzawa jumped up, startled. Without thinking, he looked for something useful. Muttering to himself that he needed to dry it, he grabbed a napkin, and without pausing to think of the consequences, began wiping her stomach directly. It wasn't until he was already doing it that he realized what he was doing. He stopped abruptly, apologized immediately, saying it had been an instinctive reaction, and asked if she was okay. Hachiya lowered her gaze, visibly embarrassed. Her face was bright red, and with a quiet voice, still touching her belly, she answered with restrained seriousness that it was still hot. The scene shifted gently. The ramen bowl was empty. The chopsticks and spoon rested on top. They had finished their meal. They left the restaurant walking side by side. Yonzawa reflected in silence. It had been an awkward moment, not the kind of situation he knew how to handle. Suddenly, he stopped. He had noticed the rest of the group approaching. He exclaimed it with surprise. Almost at the same time, Hachiya discreetly pressed her stomach, trying to hide her bloated belly. She didn't want anyone to notice anything. Yuzuki and Kuji arrived flustered, apologizing for being late. They said they had run so much to get there that they'd actually worked up an appetite. But seeing them, they asked in shock if Yonzawa and Hachiya had already eaten. All this unfolded while Hachiya kept subtly pressing her belly, as if the ramen and the entire scene from earlier had never happened. Without losing her enthusiasm, Yuzuki raised her fist energetically and suggested they go to the dessert buffet, immediately changing the course of the group. Kuji, encouraged by the suggestion, gladly agreed. He also recalled there were savory options and admitted he was absolutely starving. On the other hand, Yonzawa, with an exhausted expression, confessed that he already felt too full to eat anything else. Meanwhile, Hachiya observed in silence, salivating slightly, which made it clear that despite her verbal denials, the craving for sweets was still very present. Moments later, they arrived in front of the buffet place. The storefront promised a paradise of flavors, and the large table inside confirmed it. It was full of cakes, colorful parfaits, Mont Blancs, and cupcakes carefully decorated. At such a sight, Yuzuki let out an excited exclamation, while Hachiya, eyes sparkling, declared that everything looked delicious. Together, smiling and full of excitement, they gazed at what seemed to be their dream feast. As they approached the table, Yuzuki stopped in front of the massive variety, overwhelmed by so many options. In a low voice, she wondered where she should start. She thought it might be wise to begin with the fruit, though she feared getting full too quickly. She changed her mind several times, even considering trying one of each kind in the first round and then repeating her favorites. However, the sheer number of options only made her more indecisive. Just then, she noticed that Hachiya had already returned with a tray full of desserts. Without a hint of hesitation, she had acted with absolute determination. Watching her, Yuzuki remarked to herself that, as always, Hachiya was very decisive. That confident attitude made her recall how Hachiya and Yonzawa used to act when they studied together. Driven by curiosity, Yuzuki asked Hachiya if she hadn't been getting along a little too well with Yonzawa lately. After observing her for another moment, she quietly hinted whether she might like him. However, before Hachiya could respond, Yuzuki laughed nervously, quickly dismissing the idea and stating it was impossible, that he wasn't her type. At this, Hachiya remained silent. Yuzuki looked at her closely, surprised to see her friend's face blushing, with a soft and shy expression. That was when she realized there might actually be something more. The surprise was such that she couldn't help but raise her voice upon seeing that maiden-like look on Hachiya's face. That gaze left no doubt. Her suspicions were becoming true. Shaking her slightly, Yuzuki scolded her for having taken too many desserts. She tried to make her come to her senses, but also understood that Hachiya's attitude had changed precisely when Yonzawa was mentioned. Holding a towering pile of sweets, Hachiya remained calm, her serenity contrasting with the chaotic mountain of sugar she had gathered. Yuzuki watched her in silence, accepting that, after all, she had already figured it out. At that moment, Kuji, seeing the mountain of food, asked in disbelief whether Hachiya-san had taken all that. Yonzawa, not particularly surprised, remarked that Hachiya was impressive, as always. Hachiya, for her part, placed her hands together politely before beginning to eat. She did so without pause, devouring donuts, cupcakes, and all sorts of sweets, while her cheeks puffed up from so much chewing. Then Yonzawa, somewhat serious, reminded them that in buffets you're supposed to eat in several rounds, not all at once, warning that obviously, there was no way she could finish it all like that. That was when Yuzuki explained that right when they started talking about him. Hachiya had begun serving herself far too much. Yonzawa, visibly surprised, asked if they were really talking about him. At that moment, Hachiya turned to look at him. With a bashful yet playful expression, she placed a finger on her cheek and replied that she wasn't going to tell him. That reaction left Yonzawa completely baffled. Naturally, he pointed out that she had cream on her face. From a distance, Yuzuki watched in silence, murmuring to herself, mesmerized by the scene, acknowledging how dazzling Hachiya looked in that moment. Meanwhile, Yonzawa watched Hachiya closely, just as she calmly licked the cream off with her tongue, remaining completely serene, as if nothing could disturb her. Elsewhere, on the school soccer field, a group of students was playing a practice match. Kakamoto, wearing the number 10 jersey, was running hard, panting from exhaustion. From a distance, Yuzuki was watching him, leaning on her arms, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Without hiding her fascination, she thought he was incredibly attractive. A little later, from a hallway balcony in the school building, Yuzuki and Hachiya looked down at the field. Nervously, Yuzuki commented that, besides, Hachiya already had Yonzawa. Upon hearing those words, Hachiya averted her gaze, her cheeks slightly flushed. Yuzuki noticed the gesture and felt something wasn't quite right. Almost instantly, her mind filled with romantic imagery, sweet moments, kisses surrounded by floating hearts. With a knot in her chest, she realized that if things kept going this way, Hachiya might be taken by Yonzawa, and she admitted to herself that she couldn't bear it. Driven by that conclusion, she thought determinedly that before that happened, she too had to get a boyfriend. She turned to Hachiya, her face lit up with excitement, and said maybe she'd ask Kakamoto-senpai for his line contact that very day. Though she tried to play it off as a joke, Hachiya enthusiastically encouraged her. That push was exactly what Yuzuki needed. She clenched her fist with resolve, already set on taking action after club activities. She also mentioned that gals didn't overthink things, they just did them. From behind, Yonzawa happened to hear her energetic outburst and commented that it sounded a bit aggressive. Later, Yuzuki was already hiding between the dividers in the football club's locker room, waiting for the right moment. Carefully, she applied lip gloss and put it away right after. Her heart was pounding like crazy. She had told Hachiya to wait for her in the classroom, but at that moment she regretted not bringing her along. As she remembered the past, she mentally went back to her first year, when she attended a match. Kakamoto had scored a goal, and it was at that exact moment that she fell in love with him at first sight. Later, during another game, they exchanged a few words while she was cheering him on, but it hadn't gone beyond that. Kakamoto had thanked her with a kind smile. Now, thinking about it all, Yuzuki believed that he probably didn't even remember her. From her hiding spot, she saw him coming out with his friends. She told herself she was simply spying. She watched intently as they walked away, until Kakamoto noticed something. He had forgotten to lock the locker room. One of his teammates joked that he was great at soccer, but clueless about everything else. Kakamoto said goodbye, saying he'd be right back. From the end of the hallway, Yuzuki saw him walking alone and knew this was her chance. She ran after him, calling out loudly. Kakamoto turned around, and upon seeing her, recognized her immediately. Hearing her say his name, Yuzuki, completely flushed, asked if he happened to remember her. With a kind smile, he replied that yes, he remembered she had supported them during the games, and that, in fact, he found her quite memorable. Yuzuki, wrapped in nerves, struggled to keep herself together. She couldn't stop trembling. Kakamoto, curious, asked what she needed, since it was already getting late. Panicking, her voice trembling, she finally gathered the courage and asked for his line. Kakamoto was surprised. At that very moment, a female voice called out to him familiarly. It was Sakura, who approached with a graceful smile, informing him that she had already locked everything properly. Kakamoto, upon seeing her, blushed and smiled back. Witnessing the scene, Yuzuki couldn't hide her surprise. She watched it all, her mind racing, and immediately recognized Kurokawa Sakura, a classmate she had always thought of as quiet, very kind, and popular with both boys and girls. In that precise moment, she realized Sakura was the manager of the soccer club. Kakamoto let out a light laugh as he scratched his head, and Yuzuki gave him a faint smile, weighed down with sadness. Then, he looked back at her, as if only just returning to the conversation, and apologized for getting distracted, trying to recall what they had been talking about. Kakamoto said Yuzuki's name, but she was already gone. In another corner of the school, an empty classroom remained completely still. Hachiya was sitting alone at her desk when, suddenly, she turned her head upon hearing the door open. That was when Yuzuki entered, her face clouded with sorrow, on the verge of tears. She barely managed to say Hachiya's name before breaking down in an exaggerated sob, explaining through hiccups that she felt as though she had been rejected so gently it was almost imperceptible. Hachiya watched her in silence, not saying a single word. Deeply shaken, Yuzuki confessed she had come to a bitter realization. She explained that, for some reason she couldn't quite grasp, everyone she liked always ended up choosing girls who seemed pure and innocent. Her frustration grew as she recalled the boys she had liked in the past, calm, responsible guys who inevitably ended up choosing someone completely different from her. With a mix of anger and resignation, she let out the idea that, in the end, all men were the same. Her thoughts spilled out in a bitter complaint, expressing her frustration that everyone seemed to fall for the same kind of demure girls, while she remained on the sidelines, invisible. As she spoke, Hachiya continued listening silently, a bead of sweat running down her cheek. Yuzuki let out a heavy sigh, resigned, and went on to say that you simply couldn't compete against a modest girl. Her face shadowed. She muttered that gals like her didn't seem to stand a chance. With a broken voice, she expressed her confusion about the constant rejection, wondering why boys couldn't fall for someone like her. The silence stretched on, and Hachiya remained still, unmoved. Then, Yuzuki forced a smile and said, with hidden sadness behind a cheerful expression, that maybe it would be better to stop being a gal. Her smile widened, but her eyes reflected a deep shadow. Hachiya didn't respond right away. Instead, she stared at her intently. Suddenly, she stood up abruptly from her seat. Without a word, she grabbed Yuzuki's cheeks firmly, leaving her completely stunned. The two stood face to face in the middle of the quiet classroom. Hachiya looked at her with determination, and with absolute calm, told her she was beautiful. Then, she held Yuzuki's face gently with both hands and leaned in. Yuzuki, frozen in shock, opened her eyes wide, which sparkled intensely. Hachiya then gave her cheeks a soft shake, bringing her back to reality. Still dazed, Yuzuki thought that in the end, she only had Hachiya. Suddenly, she clung to her and hugged her tightly, breaking into tears again as she confessed that she didn't want Yonzawa to take her away. Hachiya froze in surprise, unsure how to react. At that very moment, in a nearby hallway, Yonzawa sneezed and blamed the pollen, unaware that someone was talking about him. The next morning, at Yonzawa's apartment, the TV was left on as he distractedly ate something. Suddenly, his older sister appeared, took the remote without hesitation, and changed the channel. Yonzawa protested nervously, saying he was watching that, but she smiled confidently and replied that since she contributed financially to the household, she had the right to choose what to watch. She also added that young people should hurry off to school and focus on their studies. Then she sat down, relaxed, with a drink in hand. Visibly tense, Yonzawa asked if she had come from a night shift and told her not to drink alcohol in the morning. She brushed it off, saying alcohol was adult nutritional supplement, and with a teasing smile, claimed that since she didn't smoke, she was a great person. Annoyed, Yonzawa walked away, muttering sarcastically that yes, she was super great. Later, he seriously reflected on that way of judging young people, of forcing them into arbitrary molds. He thought that when someone brought up money, there really wasn't much else to say, and remembered that his sister was only in her first year. At that moment, while walking through a nearby park, he noticed a girl sitting alone near a swing. He thought it might be Hachiya and wondered what might be wrong. Maybe she had a stomachache, as she looked somewhat pensive. From above, the park ground offered a peculiar scene. Written in white sugar was a large message in the shape of a heart that read, "Love and Peace." Tiny ants crawled across the lines, tracing the letters and their outlines, as if they too were trapped in a message they didn't fully understand. Meanwhile, Hachiya tilted a sugar packet, slowly letting its contents fall onto the ground. Not far away, Yonzawa watched the scene in disbelief as he saw the ants gathering around the sugar. He thought someone must be attracting them on purpose to form a heart, until he clearly spotted Hachiya, still holding the packet, her expression completely serious. A deep discomfort settled in immediately, as if he had just witnessed something he wasn't meant to see. Suddenly, Hachiya's eyes widened and she stepped back abruptly, losing her balance just as the ants began to crawl up her body. She quickly tried to shake them off, but it all seemed useless. Several ants walked across her clothes, visibly sending her into a panic. She hunched over awkwardly, frantically brushing them off, while Yonzawa stood completely frozen, nervously fixated on the thought that the ants were reaching her torso. Finally, Hachiya turned around, embarrassed, glancing over her shoulder. A few ants were still visible on her clothes. In a low, tense voice, she asked him to help her get them off. After assisting her, Yonzawa casually asked if they were all gone now. Hachiya, now calmer, simply adjusted her clothes discreetly without saying much else. Yonzawa glanced at her sideways, deep in thought. In his mind, an unexpected comparison began to take shape. Hachiya seemed like a child. He lowered his gaze, caught up in that reflection. In that instant, he realized he was judging her through a rigid lens, the same way his older sister did. With a sigh, he clearly understood he was repeating the same pattern of thinking. Breaking the silence, Yonzawa reminded her that if they didn't hurry, they'd be late for school. Hachiya gently raised a hand and waved goodbye to the ants as if they were old friends. Watching her leave like that, he couldn't help but smile. It was clear, Hachiya was still the same, exactly as she had always been. Moments later, they were walking together toward the school when, all of a sudden, it began to rain.